This is The Strange Recital, a podcast about fiction which questions the nature of reality.
The first time I saw the animal, I'll admit I was tired. It was late at night and I had been drinking at moderate pace for several hours. The animal could have been anything, the way it flashed across the room, and I was too slow to get a good look at it, as though my eyes had been insulated away from my mud-sozzled brain. Let's hope that wasn't a rat, I thought to myself. Why anyone should have hoped for it not being this over anything else, I couldn't say, and nor, considering I was alone at the time of that first sighting, who the implicit us was. As I said, I was tired, and sometimes sense doesn't have to be made. Nothing happened for a few days. Perhaps it had been an isolated incident, an anomaly. Perhaps it hadn't been there at all, a trick of the eye or mind, wishful thinking, paranoia, hallucination. After a few days, a false memory. But no, some nights later, I half saw the animal again, or perhaps a different one. It's true that I had once again consumed several drinks that evening, but not so many as to mistrust the evidence of my own perceptions. One sighting could have amounted to a freak happening. Twice constituted the early signs of a pattern. The next day, I purchased a rat trap. Setting traps was not an activity with which I had previously been familiar, so I was meticulous in following the instructions on the rat trap's packaging. Despite widespread depictions, it seems that cheese is not the most effective enticement for rodents of any size. I set the trap with a small piece of meat. Rats are, as further attested to by the packaging, neophobes, and I prepared myself to wait several days for this particular one to work up the courage to get itself killed. In addition to occupying a chair from which I had a reasonable view of the trap, I checked the trap many times a day. I did not touch or move it, which, so I'd read, would likely have reduced the trap's effectiveness. Initially, I'd been satisfied with the whole of my enterprise, but the trap was not successful. It trapped nothing, not even the slug which had worn away at the food scrap one evening and trailed off across the carpet, still in one piece. I was pleased not to trap the slug, which would have been unpleasant, though it was disappointing not to have trapped the rat, if that's what it had been. Perhaps, or probably, I concluded, given that no rat had been captured, the animal had not been a rat. The absence of a rat would explain the failure of the rat trap, and if the animal had not been a rat, so I reasoned, it was best not to have trapped it. Life slowly returned to its previous pre-mammalian form. Nothing disturbed my living room for the next 7 well-observed nights. The rat trap had either been a false step or a complete success as a deterrent. Either way, I wrapped the trap in an old piece of plastic and tucked it at the back of the cupboard under the kitchen sink. With a glass in hand, I returned to the lounge chair. All was quiet. I could have imagined it, the whole thing, the animal, its paths, its peripherality. If I stopped imagining things, it would be for the better. People like me aren't supposed to imagine things. Imagining things is a bad sign, and nobody likes bad signs. And yet, one evening later, I couldn't not see what I thought I saw. Surely not. Were there 2 of the creatures running across the room, double helix style? And was there me, sober as anything? And 2 nights beyond that, after a single quiet night, not 1 or 2, but 3 further little mammalian entities, the whiskey level only moderately diminished. 1, 2, 3 creatures, and not a single clear sighting. I might have reset the trap, but I wanted first to identify the little mammals. Knowledge before outcome. I substituted a notepad and pen for the trap and meat. Time passed. Hours, days, the less formal measure of bottles. No resolution. The notepad accumulated tally marks, but no details. A tally mark represented a blur, a smear in time. There was nothing clear enough to be detailed. If anything, deterioration. The animal or animals became more common and perhaps a little larger, but also fuzzier, less distinct. The fact of not getting a good look at them was hard to reconcile with the concrete nature of the world. Why were they always running across the edge of my vision and never through its middle? Why were they always just a bit too fast to see clearly, but not fast enough not to see at all? Were they watching me, waiting for me not to watch them? If so, what was their purpose? Or what was the purpose to which they had been put? Had setting the trap set them off me? Could I redeem myself through leaving food unconnected to trapping? Could I calm them through pure demeanour? These were all very good questions, as I assured myself. I devised little experiments. I would stare at a certain point for 15 minutes in order to test whether the paths of the animals were somehow controlled by the direction of my gaze. I placed elaborate roadblocks designed to funnel the animals towards my field of view. Why did they not appear at those times I had prepared myself, or at least when I had told myself I was ready for their appearance? Why did they only run in or through places or follow routes which had not been readied for them? The animals were highly intelligent, so I concluded, and they must have been waiting for me to blink or shift my head before running across. Nothing I did hindered them in any way. No diversion seemed to divert them in the least. If I set up a camera and left the room, there was never anything to be seen. They were clever, these animals, and a little larger each day. The larger they became, I reasoned, the more difficult it would be for them to maintain their hiding places. I searched the house for holes, burrows, hollows, anything that could have provided shelter. There were no signs of habitation. Troubling as the complete failure of my investigation to that time had been, much more disturbing was what followed. The animals, if that's what they were, slowed markedly. Their movements loosened and became more languorous. In slowing, they acquired it was the phrase that came to me, divine grace, as they followed these unmarked paths along which they could not be properly seen. And yet, with their reduced speed, the creatures became no more visible and observable than they had been. I pursued my attempted surveillance with even more rigour and vigour, but with no success or even promise. The animals were so large now they loomed from the edges of the room and cast shadows over everything I owned. They flowed from corner to corner, alone or in pairs or trios, and always I felt as though I could, with the right movement, possess them, and always I chose wrongly. My calls to them were more desperate now, a pleading, the repetition of the word please, a whimpering which came from within me as though detached from my will. They must have been heartless, their lack of response, their continued pauseless drifting hither and thither, as though they had no will but were nasty earthbound clouds of flesh subject to the whim of a force unseen. I tried to hate them, but I couldn't. I only wanted them. Please. The more they slowed, the more they grew. It was a vindictive, non-Darwinian evolution. The room had the impression of being loomed over. The animals perhaps lost some of the grace they had earlier gained. My space diminished, and I was pressed into its centre, the centre from which I ought to have been all-seeing. I had given up on my tallying by this point, as there always seemed to be at least one of the animals present, resistant as ever to observation. Despite the animal's size and probably mammalian presence, the room itself became colder. I wore all the clothes I owned, rugged around me, slightly constrictive. But what choice did I have? If these animals were warm-blooded as they seemed, their warmth must have been taken from the air, all currents flowing towards them, sucking the heat from anything available, anything, including me. Violence is not really part of my nature, but I admit I tried violent responses to the continuing attacks by the animal or animals on my comfort and enjoyment of the property. I swung chairs. Eyes closed, I struck out with a fork, almost overbalancing due to the failure to make contact. With my eyes open, I could see nothing. They taunted me with their slow growth. Over time, it seemed that the animals were growing together, coalescing, that there were no longer 3 or even 2 creatures just beyond my grasp, but a single vast entity. Was this possible? Vastness beyond measure or extent, and invisibility brought together in the one entity. It enveloped me. I desired nothing more than to leave this place, to abandon my home to the great heat-sapping beast, and to go anywhere else, to find somewhere beyond its reach. This was the great contradiction. It reached me everywhere, and yet I couldn't come close to it. Did I sleep? Did I wake? Did I move, or was I held still? Did I love it as it loved me? Did it feel contempt for me as I resented it? Did it feel? Did I feel? The numbness started in the pit of my stomach. It spread not by moving to contiguous parts, but by establishing little colonies of absence in my knees and shoulders and elbows. It found a dwelling place at the back of my jaw. There was nothing more to drink. I knew none of this could have been my own doing. It was all caused by this creature which had somehow discovered a path through me, through my body and my being. The numbness at times supplanted the cold, and at times amplified it. If only I knew how to summon help. I felt as though I knew nothing anymore. In a prior existence, I had had access to knowledge and to methods. Surely this was a true statement. But I could no longer be certain. The feeling, or rather the lack of feeling, stretched up the back of my head, these formerly tight little colonies now sending out tendrils or ivy-like aerial rootlets along my main internal carriageways. I could feel myself about to fall asleep, but I never did.
That was When I Saw the Animal, written and read by Bernard Cohen. This is the title story from the collection of short stories, When I Saw the Animal, by Bernard Cohen, University of Queensland Press, 2018. Hi, Bernard. Welcome to the Strange Recital. Thanks for joining us today.
Tom, it is my absolute pleasure to be here to talk about When I Saw the Animal, and g'day, Brent.
And good day to you. We've featured work by 69 different authors on the Strange Recital so far, including yourself, and you're the first from Australia, so it's a special moment, maybe even a cause for celebration.
Yeah, good idea.
Yes, well, as there are 25 million Australians and about 8 billion people on Earth, I do feel that perhaps I'm slightly overrepresented here, but...
Oh, ow.
Oh, sorry, Brent. Want one?
Sure.
Just a momentary celebration here. Here you go, Bernard.
Thanks, Tom.
You're welcome. And finally, after 8 years, here's to the first piece of Australian literature on the Strange Recital. And may there be more. And thank you, Bernard. Cheers.
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 Not bad for alcohol-free champagne.
Not bad at all.
And we're sober as anything. Now, where were we? Oh, yes. I've got a friend who's an English author, and she's been to Australia quite a bit. She told me she thinks that the relationship to literature is different there than in the UK or America. Different in a good way. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I think, what's my relationship to literature? I spend as much time as possible procrastinating, and when I'm doing well, my procrastination is also productive. I'm not sure what the relationship would be like with literature in the UK or America. I lived in the UK for a few years, and I guess I got a sense of it being publicly supported by the National Lottery. So the more people gambled, the more literature was produced in the UK. Not sure about here.
That's interesting. I must confess that my exposure to the creative output of Australia is mostly limited to singing Waltzing Matilda in my 5th grade class, plus the occasional Peter Weir or Bruce Beresford or Baz Luhrmann movie, some of which are among my favorites now that I think of it. Your writing has won some awards. Do you see it heading for the cinema?
Yeah, I'd love that, Brent. That would be pretty amazing, especially for a story like When I Saw the Animal, which has one protagonist seeing imaginary things while sitting in a chair, I imagine a darkened room. My last novel, which is called The Anti-Biography of Robert F. Menzies, tells the story of a former Australian Prime Minister who is chanted back to earth by the forces of nostalgia. And I'd really like to develop that into a musical. So that's probably a project that's a bit closer than a feature film.
Now, this story struck me as a kind of Kafkaesque feedback loop, where what at first seemed a minor annoyance or an almost imperceptible anomaly is amplified quite quickly into a life-threatening existential crisis. Did you set out to do this deliberately, or did the story just run away with itself?
Tom, I think I was probably writing the story at about the same time as it is now in Australia or in Sydney, which is about 2:30 a.m. And at that time, sounds take on a slightly different feel to during the middle of the day, so that the hum of a refrigerator or a motorcycle along the nearby expressway or a cargo plane going overhead does amplify itself into all kinds of potential scenarios. So, yeah, I was probably just writing realism, just the perceptions of what life is like at 2:30 in the morning when things ought to be utterly silent but aren't.
I like the way you established immediately, in the first paragraph, an unusual voice, or rather, an unusual narrator. Maybe the adjective mud-sozzled is known in Australia, but to me it was entirely new and definitely got my attention. Then the narrator's question of who exactly is the us, implicit in the expression, let's hope, made me smile. Whoever asks that. So there's a certain interiority, a self-conscious neurosis in this narrator that's very entertaining. So, what is my question? I don't know.
Well, that's good, Brent, because I guess I don't have to know my answer either. I feel that the term mud-sozzled is particular to this narrator in this story. I try to find the way that a narrator will engage with the situation and turning things up inside the head of the narrator, especially of a narrator who believes themselves to be utterly rational, well-organised, in control, I feel creates that kind of humour. And I think here it's the humour where the narrator believes themselves to be sozzled not by the alcohol, but rather by the atmosphere in which these animals might or might not appear.
Well, the way you describe the eponymous animal, seen but not seen, small but large, singular but plural, the way it metastasizes, it makes me wonder if you were using it symbolically or allegorically, and if so, of what? And you refer to it as a mammal, not a marsupial, a reptile, a bird, or an insect. Is there any significance to that, or am I trying too hard?
I don't think I set out to use it symbolically or allegorically, but I feel that once I'd done it, I thought, yeah, this is a story about things that are just out of reach and feel like they should be within reach. I'm not sure about the significance of it not being an insect. I suppose I hadn't thought what sort of a mammal it was. And you're definitely not trying too hard.
Good.
I enjoyed the whole story, so forgive me for being stuck on the first paragraph, which you end with the statement, "Sometimes sense doesn't have to be made." I'm tempted to borrow that as a new tagline for our podcast. Maybe it's not just the narrator's statement, but your own. If so, tell us why, when it comes to writing fiction, that's a true statement.
Thanks very much, Brent. I'd love to see that as your tagline and also as mine. I've always felt that there were a couple of very particular roles for fiction, and one is to argue with stuff, because to argue in fiction, you don't have to make big changes in the world. You just have to put forward a vision of something that doesn't fit whatever the pattern is that is pre-given.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose a corollary of that is fiction is a fabulous way to explore possibilities. It is cheap, it's effective, you can build a world in an hour, and you can test any theories among whoever happens to inhabit that world. So if what comes out of that experiment is that the initial hypothesis, which presumably you're testing from somewhere else, doesn't make sense, well, I think you have made a discovery about the world.
This story has the modern logic or illogic of a dream, a nightmare, I'd say. Is that where it originated? Did you wake up one morning and say, "That was terrifying, I have to write it down"?
If androids dream of electric sheep, what do insomniacs dream of? I am a bit of an insomniac, and I've always been a night person rather than a day person, and I like that time after everyone else has gone to sleep.
Yeah.
And I went through a phase, I suppose, a few years ago of just going for walks at 2 a.m. down to a bay that's a kilometre or so. That's like 0.6 of a mile from where I live. And you meet the most interesting people. And some of it, I guess, you write down.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also interested in how this highly praised story refuses to abide by classic story conventions. Specifically, there's no resolution at the end. Pretend I'm your high school English teacher asking you to defend that choice. What would you say?
I don't know. I think it maybe has that kind of Frankenstein ending of walking out across the ice or something. I had the most wonderful high school English teacher, and she sort of told me just to go for stuff, or she predicted that I'd become a writer.
Wow.
Well, she actually predicted that I'd become a writer of graffiti, but, that's close.
Yeah, close enough for government work. Now, aside from writing novels and short stories and a children's book or two, I gather that you started an organisation called the Writing Workshop. Tell us a bit about that.
I started the writing workshop 18 years ago, or even more now, and I wanted to have a writer-run workshop for young people. I think in schools, young people are shown a lot of finished work and told that that's the goal, but they don't see process.
Mm-hmm.
So my idea was that writers would run workshops where they were inventive, where they were generous with young people, so school-age kids could see the writing process happening in front of them and then work with process rather than just going for a finished product at the end.
Mm.
So it's been going all right. I've actually taught about 120,000 people from kindergarten up to the end of school.
Amazing.
And I do face-to-face workshops in Australia, mostly in Sydney, and online workshops for people who can squeeze themselves into the right sorts of time zone or do things in a self-paced way. So, that's been kind of bread and butter, really, as for me and some other writers, as well as having the chance to engage with many, many thousands of young people.
Well, I commend you for that. Are you currently involved in any new writing projects? Another book soon?
Sometimes I feel like I'm a writer of half books. So I've got, I think, 7 in progress at the moment. The one most likely to finish soon, I think, is a strange version of the life of the English architect John Soane, who set up a museum in central London of all the objects that he'd collected, partially because he wanted to share them with Londoners and partly because he wanted to disinherit his son. So I feel that it's a novel based around the objects collected in the museum and using those objects to reflect the life of everybody who lived in what was then a house. I'm also working on a book about teaching writing, a book of poetry, another book of short stories, and a couple of other ideas for novels. But, it's like an expressway, a motorway with lanes for different speeds. And I'm not sure which book is going to be in the fast lane.
Wow, quite prolific. At least you have airbags. So we were introduced to your story and to you by our mutual friend, Mr. Thompson. He told me once that he was suffering an invasion of fruit flies. Do you think that in some way he could have been experiencing your story? Is he okay?
Yes, Tom, thank you very much. I do believe that Mr. Thompson is okay. And I further think that I may have an explanation for the fruit fly plague. He lives over the back fence from another friend of mine, who I shall call, for the sake of this anecdote, Mr. Butcher. Now, Mr. Butcher grows a wide variety of chilies of different heat values, and I believe that it could be these that have attracted the fruit flies, and once they are in the vicinity of Mr. Thompson, I feel that they have found their way into his fruit bowl with little effect to him. So, yes, I think he's fine.
Well, glad to hear it. I was concerned.
Well, guys, I think that about wraps it up. Thanks for talking with us, and I hope we can do it again sometime.
Yeah, thanks, Bernard.
Thanks very much, Brent. Thanks, Tom. It has been a pleasure. Thanks very much, and until next time.
Yeah, I look forward to it. What was that?
What?
That thing.
What thing?
It looked like a black duck. This is The Strange Recital, on the web at thestrangerecital.com. The music on this episode was The Importance of Being the Sun by XJ5000 from their album The James Masons. This is episode 24111. And here's a B-flat diminished 7th chord.